Of late, I've been talking a lot about very macro, big picture items like how we are meant to function as humans, what our true human nature is, what the objective or purpose of life is to help guide that. Very, very macro topics. With that said, over the last 7 months, which is how long I've been making these videos, one a day, I've obviously touched on a number of different topics. So what I want to try to do here is, as a first step, is connect some of the dots between those, connect and bring the macro down to the micro a little bit and start to see the practical application of it and how it all fits together, if it does, right? And this will be an ongoing process. So what I've talked about most recently is the idea that, from a first principles perspective, our purpose on life, if you had to go as base as you can go, is to grow as a species, right? To spread, to procreate, is one, and also some component of like seeking pleasure or avoiding discomfort. In my mind, at least as of right now, those are kind of the two base things we seek. So when you think about that as kind of the objective, and then you say, okay, how do you think about that practically? What's the practical implication of that? Well, you could start with kind of a simple view of it, which says every individual should just maximize for those things, right? And there's an argument to be made for that, that you shouldn't get caught up in all the minutia. You shouldn't get caught up in all the things that we create issues around. Very simply, that's our purpose in life. You should optimize for spreading, right? Procreating to some extent, because that's our natural biological driver, and maximizing pleasure, avoiding discomfort. If you optimize for that, you're doing it right. And it's hard to argue that. There's a moral piece of it, which feels like, I don't know if that feels right, but from a very base perspective, that seems logical at least. So there's that, right? You can act in that way and just say that's how I'm going to act. Now, within that realm, you could try and put some guardrails in. And this is what I spoke about in the last video, which is you can try and do that as efficiently as possible. You can try and minimize friction around that. So as you're trying to optimize and maximize, to seek pleasure, avoid discomfort, etc., you can minimize friction and say, hey, I'm not going to do it at the expense of other people to where it's going to actually take away from my objective. Or even if it's going to help me towards my objective, it may still cause me to not pursue it as wholeheartedly as I would if I think it's going to impact other people negatively, right? And again, morals start to come into that to some extent. So you can go all the way to the one side of the spectrum and say, I don't give a shit about anybody or anything. My only purpose here is to maximize or optimize for those things. I'm going towards it. Or you could pull yourself in a little bit, be a little bit more strategic, optimize for it, but minimize friction, right? So you could do that. That makes me start to think about what I've talked a lot about in some of these videos, the idea of people in positions of power and how they are uniquely positioned, because there's being in a position of power. Typically, we look to exploit that power. We look to take advantage of that power towards those ends, towards maximizing our own pleasure, minimizing our discomfort. And because we're in a position of power, we can do that. It's either within our ability or we feel like we have the right to because we've earned some position of power. But I think that gets to another category of, a way of acting or behaving, which is being in a position where, or taking the position where you say, I know my natural drive, inclination is to just seek out pleasure, but I am going to go counter to that somewhat. I am going to try and transcend that, and I'm going to try and make more people's lives better, not just my own, which seems very moralistic, right? That's the way in which we should function. But I want to try and look at it through this angle that I've been looking at, kind of the purpose of life, because it seems unnatural. I've talked about Nietzsche a lot recently. Obviously, he's influencing my thinking to some extent. You could say that's somewhat of his view. I think his view takes a different path on it, but that's somewhat of his view, right? It's beyond good and evil. It's not just the morals. It's unnatural for us to worry about helping other people and rising them up beyond the minimizing friction that we talked about in the second scenario, because that still is somewhat self-serving. You're minimizing friction because you want to ensure you get to your objective with the least discomfort possible. This is saying you're almost introducing friction into the system, but for a greater good. You're making things harder. You're making it harder for you to reach your objective potentially, or at least you're not optimizing for it, because you want to optimize for making other people's lives better. Now, from where I sit and how I grew up in the culture I grew up in, that feels like a very good and noble thing to do. That feels like the right way to approach it. So I want to acknowledge that bias up front, because just because it feels good and right doesn't mean that it's true or that's how we should act, but it feels good and right. So you look at people like that and you say, you need some portion of those people in the world, right? You need some portion of that, or ideally you want some portion of that, because most of us, myself likely very much included, don't have the ability, whether it be the intellectual capacity, whether it be the mental toughness, to act in that vein. We, at best, can try and minimize friction and be in the middle there and say, I'm going to do things that are ultimately self-serving, but I'm going to try and do them in such a way in which I don't hurt other people, and I'm trying to be as efficient as possible about it, right? That's most people, I would say. There are some people that sit on the other side that say, fuck it all, I'm going to do things that are self-serving, and I'll burn this whole shit down if I have to for my own purposes. There's certainly that population of people. Those are people I've referred to in other videos as using their superpowers to some extent for evil. Those are people in positions of power that do what people typically do with power. They abuse it, they try and retain it at all costs, etc. But then you have that counter set, you have that offset. The people that I think really make a difference when you step back, at the very macro level and look over the course of human history, there's people like that actually move society towards the better. They bring pleasure. They help other people reach their objectives. They help the population grow. They help people seek pleasure and avoid discomfort at a macro kind of aggregate level. And those people are the ones that are maybe most impactful to what we do. And it's that ability to say, I'm going to optimize for something that's somewhat unnatural for what I would normally optimize for. And if you want to hone in on it maybe one step deeper, just for the sake of this video, perhaps the best way to do it, right? Because I keep saying they do it in somewhat of an unnatural way. Well, if there is a portion of the population that they actually get benefit from it, it actually does bring them pleasure. It is somewhat self-serving for them to help other people because for whatever reason, right? Not to say I am one of those people, but it's in this vein, a people pleaser, right? There are certain people who get off on or enjoy or get pleasure from making other people's lives better, truly, right? That's what's built in and ingrained in their DNA. Well, those seem like the exact right people if you can pair them with the intellectual capacity and the mental toughness to some extent to do the hard stuff. That would seem to be that core set of the population that can really drive this and push this forward. And I think there's something in that that's worth exploring and understanding. What is it about that population? Is that right? Like, am I reading this right? Am I assessing it right? And how do you assess that population? And I'll end on this from a very practical perspective. And this ties to the philosopher king, kind of Socrates, Plato view. In many ways, as we think about who we want our leaders to be, whether they be politicians, in industry, whatever it is, that's what you're trying to find. You're trying to find those people who sit on that end of the spectrum, who are willing to do the unnatural thing, or maybe for them somewhat natural, who are willing to say, I'm going to optimize for everybody else's objective, rather than just focus on my own.